Professor Donna Orsuto is originally from Ohio. She is the co-founder and director of the Lay Center at Foyer Unitas. She's also a professor at the Institute of Spirituality of the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, Italy, and an adjunct professor of the Faculty of Theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelicum. She lectures extensively and gives retreat in various parts of the world. She's involved in ecumenical and inter-religious dialogue. Having served as a consultor for the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue and as a member of the Commission for Ecumenism and Dialogue of the Diocese of Rome. On 7 October 2011, Pope Benedict XVI named her a Dame of the Pontifical Esquerium Order of St. Gregory the Great. Our beloved, congratulations. It is obvious that we have amongst us a woman of vast knowledge and rich experience in relating with our brothers and sisters of other denominations and faith. I'm sure Professor Donna will open our hearts and our minds to the urgent and important call of the need for interreligious dialogue in our world today. Professor Donna.
Good morning to you all. Thank you, Sister Anne, for introducing me, and to Sister Carmen and Sister Pat for the invitation to speak today. I'm deeply grateful for this privilege, the privilege you've given to me as a laywoman to be with you in this assembly, and for entrusting to me the task to reflect with you on the theme, Sowers of Prophetic Hope, the call to interreligious dialogue. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to just say how amazed I am by how beautifully and carefully this assembly has been organized. This is surely because of the hard work, not only of the executive leadership, but also of the staff, the translators, and the technical team. You are amazing. And also to all of you religious superiors, I want to say how inspired I have been in these days by your joy, your prayerfulness, and your commitment to go to the peripheries. I'd like to begin with an image that hopefully you will see, and you do, on the screen. It's entitled Followers of God, and it was painted in 1978 by the French artist Dolores Puteaux. It depicts Pope Paul VI standing in St. Peter's Square with his arms raised to welcome various religious leaders. Such a meeting actually never took place in that year. And if you read the official church documents focused on interreligious dialogue in 1978, you would have to say that such a meeting of the Holy Father in the Vatican with leaders of world religions would have seemed almost unthinkable. It's true that Nostra Aetate had already been promulgated, and Paul VI had called for dialogue in Ecclesiam Suam and was practicing it himself on his apostolic journeys. But the time was perhaps not yet ripe for leaders of world religions to be welcomed in the Vatican. Yet, over the years, many people had the prophetic courage to let their imagination envision a future different from the past. Along the way, these women and men quietly, gently, and patiently worked to make that dream a reality. Today, such meetings between the Pope and leaders from other religions are seen as quite normal, both in the Vatican and on apostolic journeys. A recent example is Pope Francis's visit to the United Arab Emirates and his visit to Morocco. A hallmark of his pontificate is a dialogue of fraternity with people of other religions. The seeds for Francis's approach to dialogue were sown during the Second Vatican Council. They were nurtured during the pontificates of Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. Recognizing this progression is important because it encourages us as we embrace our call to engage in interreligious dialogue. We are invited to walk together in communion with our church leaders. As the African proverb goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The first part of this presentation will present some highlights, insights from the magisterium during these decades of dialogue that help us to understand the context of our call to be prophetic sowers of hope today through our participation in interreligious dialogue. In the second part, I will attempt to answer the question, why does Pope Francis reach out to people of other religions? Why should we do the same? How can we become sowers of prophetic hope as we embrace this call? An anchor for our contemporary understanding or called to engage in interreligious dialogue is the Second Vatican Council's declaration Nostra Aetate. This dynamic, and I would say prophetic and courageous document of 1965 does not focus on dialogue in an abstract way, but rather reminds us that dialogue among peoples is at the heart of what interreligious dialogue is all about. Dialogue among peoples. The purpose of this encounter is to grow in mutual understanding. For example, specifically with respect to Christian-Muslim dialogue, Nostra Aetate 3 states, over the centuries, many quarrels and dissensions have arisen between Christians and Muslims. The Sacred Council now pleads with all to forget the past and urges that a sincere effort be made to achieve mutual understanding. Friends, this is 1965 that this was written. One of the ways of growing in mutual understanding is to participate in interreligious dialogue. Paul VI's first encyclical, Ecclesiam Suam, a document that greatly influenced Pope Francis, still has much to say about dialogue in general, which can also be applied to interreligious dialogue, exchange. For Paul VI, you and I enter into dialogue because our experience of God's love encourages us to do so. We were created in the image and likeness of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, for communion and dialogue. Salvation history is the unfolding of that dialogue. The history of salvation narrates exactly this long and changing dialogue. It's a conversation with Christ, of Christ with humanity. It's above all a dialogue of love. For this is how God is known. We honor and serve God through sharing that love with others. In Ecclesiam Suam, Pope Paul VI suggests that there are 4 key characteristics of dialogue. Though underlined more than 50 years ago, they are immensely useful for today. And they are worth remembering here in this place. First of all, dialogue must be marked by clarity. Is my language understandable, acceptable, and well chosen when I enter into dialogue with others? One might add that clarity also implies a clear sense of personal identity. For example, over the last 25 years, I have had the privilege, and it's truly a privilege, of living with people from various religious backgrounds: Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu brothers and sisters. In living this dialogue of everyday life, it would be a disservice to them to pretend that living my faith as a Roman Catholic Christian is not central to who I am. It's very much a part of me, and that's how I'm called to live. Similarly, their religious belief and practices are integral to their lives and deserve to be respected. It's precisely because we are clear about our personal identities that we can enter into dialogue. The second characteristic suggested by Saint Pope Paul VI is meekness. Meekness is not usually talked about too much today, but it's really important for genuine dialogue. I notice that often in English translations of Ecclesiam Suam, the word humility is used instead of meekness. The exemplar of both of these attitudes is Jesus, who is meek and humble of heart. The meek are free from haughtiness and resentment, even when they've experienced reproach and injury. Meekness is incompatible with violent methods of acting, whether physical or psychological. Meekness calls forth a gentleness, which would mean that one would never impose or force oneself or one's way of life on another. When we truly live this beatitude, we also learn not to take ourselves too seriously. We begin to acknowledge that God's providence is at work in surprising ways in our lives, and this consequently flows into our attitude towards dialogue. The third characteristic is trust or confidence. It's trust in God. It's trust in the Holy Spirit. As Catherine of Siena says, without this guide, we cannot go on. We need to trust in God. But we need to also have a trust and confidence in our own words inspired by God. And also, we need to recognize the goodwill of both parties involved in dialogue. Trust enables us to speak the word to one another with frankness, but this word is always spoken in charity. The fourth characteristic of dialogue is prudence, which encourages us to adapt ourselves to those around us. It means to learn the sensitivities of our audience. It encourages us to truly listen to the other. It's though a listening that requires one to listen to the words behind the words, as one of my friends likes to say. What people are trying to communicate is often veiled. Behind a clumsy word may be hidden a gesture of love. An angry word may mask pain and suffering. A timid word may be a cry for love and acceptance. Until we learn to listen to the words behind the words, our dialogue will never reach the depth that leads to the transformation of ourselves and of others. This is not easy. This is not easy because we're always trying to formulate our response even as others are speaking. I am inspired by the words of Saint Benedict at the beginning of the prologue of his rule, where he says, listen carefully. Listen carefully to the master's instruction and attend to them with the ear of your heart. Listen carefully. Attend with the ear of your heart. St. John Paul II was deeply influenced by Ecclesiam Suam, and he put into practice what Paul VI said about dialogue. He fearlessly and prophetically forged a path to greater understanding with people of other religions. Who can forget that historic moment in 1986 in Assisi when he first met with religious leaders around the world to pray for peace? I have that image on the slide if we can show it eventually. And in 1999, he showed a similar meeting he hosted a similar meeting at the Interreligious Assembly in St. Peter's Square. It was amazing to be in St. Peter's Square on that day. I'll never forget it. In his apostolic exhortation, Redemptoris Missio, John Paul II also reminds us that dialogue and proclamation are intrinsically intertwined and they mutually support one another. He also distinguishes between various types of dialogue. The first sort of dialogue that probably comes to your mind is the dialogue of experts or of theological exchange. This official dialogue is conducted by the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue and locally and regionally through the bishops' conferences and dioceses. In recent years, the circle of participants in most cases, at least internationally, has broadened to include women, including women religious. Alleluia. Because you bring expertise also to the table and participate fully in, these women, religious women, have participated fully in both the dialogue and in drafting of official texts. There are other forms of dialogue, including the dialogue of life, the dialogue of action, the dialogue of religious experience. Pope Francis has recently spoken of a dialogue of fraternity, but more on that later. One point is clear. Interreligious dialogue is not an optional activity in the church. I would go so far as to say that dialogue is meant to be a way of life. It's been suggested that if John Paul II planted seeds for promoting dialogue, Pope Benedict XVI pruned the plants, and Pope Francis has harvested them. It would be beyond the scope of this short reflection to focus on the various dimensions of Pope Benedict's approach to dialogue. I would like to mention just one point from his pontificate, which I think is immensely important, namely the important role he gives to cultivating friendship with people of other religions. And you see this consistently when you look at the documentation concerning his apostolic journeys when he meets people of other religions. The theme of friendship consistently emerges. Friendship, as you know, is also an important dimension for Pope Francis's approach to people of other religions. His approach is best understood in the context of his invitation to create a culture of encounter. He explains, and I quote him, "For me, this word, encounter, is very important. Encounter with others. Why? Because faith is an encounter with Jesus, and we must do what Jesus does, encounter others. We live in a culture of conflict, a culture of fragmentation, a culture of waste. We must create a culture of encounter, a culture of friendship, a culture in which we find brothers and sisters, in which we can also speak with those who think differently, as well as those who hold other beliefs who do not have the same faith. They all have something in common with us. They are images of God. They are children of God." This quotation brings out two important points. First of all, encountering others is Jesus's way of being and acting. At the root of our encounter with others is the deep experience we have each had of our encounter with Jesus. As Christians, we are invited to be in dialogue with others, but always with a third person present, Christ. As Alred of Rievaulx wrote in his classical book on spiritual friendship, here we are, you and I hope a third Christ is in our midst. Christ is the center, the foundation, and the final end of all dialogue with others. And we are invited to seek and to recognize the face of Christ in our midst. The second point is that Pope Francis reminds us that we all have something in common with people of other religions. We are all created in the image and likeness of God. A consequence of this teaching is that we are all brothers and sisters. We are called to be there for one another. We are beings of encounter. Now, in this first section, I've briefly set the context for why dialogue is an integral part of our Christian call. We've seen it's not an optional activity for us. And so, as religious women called to be sowers of prophetic hope, you are invited to embrace this call. And you might ask, especially in the context of the many challenges you face, why should we follow the example of Pope Francis and commit ourselves again to this dialogue? How can we prepare ourselves to embrace this call? What are some of the practical steps that we can take to respond in a prophetic way to this call? And this will be the focus of the second part. Even if you and I leave official church teaching aside, we need only to browse social media to realize the urgency of engaging in interreligious dialogue. With so much conflict in the world today, we simply do not have the luxury to stand aside and pretend that dialogue does not concern us. All of us who are baptized are co-responsible for the church's mission in the world. And all of us are called to be protagonists of interreligious dialogue. As Pope Francis has said, dialogue is a necessary condition for peace in the world. And so it is a duty of Christians as well as of other religious communities. Each of us, in our own small way, can make a difference if only we have the courage and are prophetic enough to risk engaging the other. We engage in interreligious dialogue because we must. And now I would like to mention 5 practical ways to engage in interreligious dialogue. The first, recognize that many of you are already directly involved in interreligious dialogue, and strengthen these relationships. Many of your religious congregations are already sowing seeds of prophetic hope. Your schools, your hospitals, your institutions serve people of other religions and have been doing so for years. Many of you have worked side by side with people of other religions in your apostolate. The impact you have had cannot be underestimated. I heard recently about how, for example, in Palestine, a religious congregation which takes care of children with disabilities from different religious and cultural backgrounds created an environment where it became normal for parents and children from different religions to gather to celebrate a birthday. This might seem like a small gesture, but such sharing transforms a culture of suspicion into a culture of encounter. Many religious women have shown solidarity with people of other religions in harrowing situations of suffering. In war-torn countries, many of you have chosen to stay. I think, for example, of the recently beatified 19 Algerian martyrs, among whom there were 6 religious women. As you recognize, and thank God for what you are already doing, you might also ask the question, are there ways of strengthening the bonds that are already present. The second point is reach out to your neighbor. Reach out to your neighbor. Pope Francis encourages us not merely encounter others, but to forge relationships of friendship with them. Concretely, this means that we don't wait for tragedy to strike, a terrorist attack, or a natural disaster to reach out to others. We need to ask the question now, today, who is my neighbor? Who are the people from other religions in my neighborhood, in my city? Though medical experts might not agree today, perhaps we can apply Aristotle's advice that friendship takes time, and therefore we need to eat a barrel of salt together. Now, we probably shouldn't take that literally. I know my doctor wouldn't be happy about that. But everything that table fellowship suggests is necessary for engaging in interreligious dialogue. There is something sacred about hospitality and table fellowship that breaks down barriers and opens up communication. It's no surprise at all that the Gospels often portray Jesus at table with others, and that it's in the context of a meal that Jesus chose to mark the gift of himself to us in the Eucharist. Practically, what can this mean for us? We can, first of all, know when our neighbors' religious feasts are celebrated and reach out to invite them, to perhaps invite them for a meal or to join them in celebrating. In these days where I live at the Lay Center, we are with one of our students who is celebrating Ramadan. And the possibility of sharing that iftar meal together is a real joy for the community members. Also, I know religious women who live in minority countries often join Muslim families for iftar, the daily feast that breaks the Ramadan fast. The third point is to cast out fear through knowledge. Learn more about people of other religions and their beliefs. You religious have a particular responsibility to foster a love that casts out fear. Now, some scripture scholars say that the phrase, "do not be afraid," occurs in one form or another 366 times in the Bible, one for every day of the year, including leap year. I have to confess, I have not been able to verify that. I tried, but even if it's not true, it sure is good. We see that a culture of encounter and dialogue flourishes when people are not paralyzed by fear. It takes incredible courage to risk reaching out to the other, especially after experiences of extreme violence. But when people have had the courage to move beyond their fears and risk reaching out to others, the results have been transformative. One of the ways of combating fear is through a deeper knowledge of the other. Knowledge can eradicate the false perceptions we have of others and their religion. For this reason, Pope Francis highlights the importance of suitable training, especially for promoting dialogue, for example, with Muslims. This is what Pope Francis says. quote, "In order to sustain dialogue with Islam, suitable training is essential for all involved, not only so that they can solidly and joyfully be grounded in their own identity, but so they can also acknowledge the values of others, appreciate the concerns underlying their demands, and shed light on shared beliefs. We Christians should embrace with affection and respect Muslim immigrants to our countries in the same way that we hope and ask to be received and respected in countries of Islamic tradition. Though many of your congregations are already involved in a dialogue of life with Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and others, one might ask the question, how many of your sisters have received formal training for dialogue with others? Basic knowledge of other religions for all of us is important. But I'd like to take a step further. We need well-trained religious women sitting at the table of official dialogues that are taking place. I repeat, we need you sitting at the table of the official dialogues that are taking place. And this will imply investing significant resources in the education and formation of your sisters for interreligious dialogue. There's a growing recognition that a community of ongoing spiritual and professional support is critical in sustaining and nurturing leaders trained in dialogue, not only during the years of formal education, but also throughout your professional life's ongoing formation. Conferences and seminars, formal and informal gatherings, retreats, and the use of social media are essential for sharing information, sharpening insights, and supporting each other. The assumptions and demands for interreligious dialogue are becoming more rigorous than ever. Effective dialogue requires not just acknowledging all participants to be sincere and of goodwill, but also includes the careful examination of differing positions and the discerning exploration of assumptions behind them. To do this, we need training. And we need to make a commitment to prepare more religious women to competently participate along with men in dialogue. This would enhance not only the quality of the dialogue, but give more credible witness to the church's teaching on the equality and the complementarity of women and men. There are numerous educational institutions and opportunities in Rome and in other parts of the world where scholarships are available to support sisters who could be trained in interreligious dialogue. And if you need any addresses, just please speak to Sister Patricia or me. We'd be happy to give you some information. The fourth point is pray. Pray for peace between people of different religions. In his address to the Fraternity Conference in the United Arab Emirates, Pope Francis said that prayer is essential. While sincerely intended prayer incarnates the courage of otherness in regards to God, it also purifies the heart from turning in on itself. Prayer of the heart restores fraternity. It restores, if I may add, sisterhood. Consequently, as for the future of interreligious dialogue, the first thing we have to do is pray. And pray for one another. We are brothers and sisters. Without the Lord, nothing is impossible. With him, everything becomes so. May our prayer, each one according to his or her own tradition, adhere fully to the will of God, who wants all men and women to recognize that they are brothers and sisters and live as such, forming the great human family in the harmony of diversity. And Pope Francis goes on to say rather starkly, there is no alternative. We will either build the future together, or there will be no future, or there will not be a future. Religions, in particular, cannot renounce the urgent task of building bridges between peoples and cultures. The time has come when religions should more actively exert themselves with courage and audacity, and without pretense, to help the human family deepen the capacity for reconciliation, the vision of hope, and the concrete path of peace. So here, Pope Francis encourages us to pray for peace. I would make an appeal to you, religious superiors. I know that many of your congregations mission elderly members to pray for certain persons or apostolates. Would it be possible to mission some sisters to pray, for example, for people of other religions in your part of the country, in your city, and to pray for peace among people of different religions in the troubled parts of the world? The fifth and my final point focuses on a fundamental attitude of dialogue, namely gazing at the other with the eyes of God. It's no surprise that interreligious dialogue flourishes and has flourished, especially among monks and nuns who share a dialogue of religious experience. Contemplation as a way of life leads one not only to see God, but also to see others as God sees them. In an account well known to us, the martyrdom of the 7 Trappists in Algeria and the moving testament of Don Christian de Chergé, there's an insight into what this can mean. His testament has a subtitle, Quand on a deux son visage, or when a farewell is contemplated. Much stronger than the English equivalent farewell, adieu literally means to God. The word envisager means envisioned or contemplated, but it can also mean something that has been given a visage or has been given a face. So the subtitle could be Contemplating when God has been given a face. In this context, we can perhaps understand the depths of Dom Christian's words when he wrote, "And also you, the friend of my final moment, who would not be aware of what you are doing. Yes, I say this thank you and this adieu to you, in whom I see the face of Christ." In commenting on this passage, one Trappist notes that this capacity of seeing God's face, God's incarnation in the person who is slitting your throat, is certainly the fruit of a profound contemplative life, lived in deep relationship with a group of brothers, with a church, and with the whole human family. If dialogue is the new name of charity, then what greater expression of charity is there than to lay down your life for others? As I read this moving account, it's a reminder that the very best preparation for a dialogue of life is a life of contemplation. This is what enables us to see the face of Christ in the other. And this is what gives us the courage to enter into a dialogue without frontiers. In conclusion, I'd like to cite the words of Sister Yvonne Gera, a Franciscan missionary of Mary who worked for 22 years in Algeria and who knew personally all of the recently beatified Algerian martyrs. When asked what to say to religious living in crisis-ridden countries, she replied, "We are missionaries. Whatever happens, we are missionaries. We know that is our vocation. And I say one thing: you will receive more than you give. It's sometimes difficult, yes, but the Lord has called us. If the people suffer, we suffer with them. It's our vocation, and the Lord is always there to help us, even in suffering or in martyrdom." These 19 martyrs knew that they were targeted, but they remained. "Don't be afraid," she says, "the Lord is there to help you." Don't be afraid, the Lord is there to help you. These are encouraging words also for you and for me as we embrace the call to engage in interreligious dialogue, as we courageously sow seeds of prophetic hope in the world today. Remember these words: don't be afraid, the Lord is there to help you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Donna, for this very inspiring